This is your Irish Diary, presenting the romance and reality of Irish life then and now. Auric Éireann, or Irish Diary, is presented by the Patrick Butler Family Foundation of St. Paul. Professor John McKiernan of the College of St. Thomas in St. Paul is writer and narrator.
This is the demolition of the Abbey Theatre, the first state-subsidized theater of our Western world. A theater, too, that is forever immortalized in the name of Sean O'Casey. I should like to tell you a little bit about this great dramatist, and also to discuss with you one of his magnificent plays, one of the plays that brought him early success. I can remind you, of course, of what you already know. That is, that he was born in 1880 in the Dublin slums, one of 13 children, in fact, the last one, a very weakly child, a child whose eyes early in his life gave him trouble, and gave him trouble all his life, a child who was almost blind, who grew into a boy who had to work long hours at all sorts of odds and ends of jobs, and who even, as the play that I'll tell you about on this program, Juno and the Paycock, as that play was making his name a world name, at that moment he was still repairing streets as a laborer. But I'd like to use the opportunity that television gives us to bring to you a visual sense of the tremendous drama, both social and national, both political and economic, that helped shape that man and gave to his thoughts a lifelong color. We'll turn to Dublin for that and present to you this picture of the new Liberty Hall on the banks of the Liffey in Dublin. This Liberty Hall is the headquarters of the Irish labor movement, a movement with which O'Casey's name has long been associated. O'Casey's thinking has always been dominated by a compassion for the poor and for the downtrodden. And this meant for him, in his circumstances, it meant sympathy for the laboring man. Therefore, we must turn now to James Connolly's words. James Connolly, the great Irish labor leader. If you notice at the top of your screen, if you're able to read this, Ní saoirse gan saoirse lucht oibre. There is no freedom without freedom for the working people. And of the efforts of the Irish labor unions to raise the level of life for these people, James Connolly says, it found the workers, that is the union did, the Irish Transport and General Workers Union, found the workers of Ireland on their knees and has striven to raise them to the erect position of manhood. It found them with all the vices of slavery in their souls, and it strove to eradicate these vices and replace them with some of the virtues of free men. It found them with no other weapons of defense than the arts of the liar, the lickspittle, and the toady, and it combined them and taught them to abhor these arts and rely proudly on the defense of power of combination. That tribute, written of the Irish General and Transport Workers Union, could easily have been written by O'Casey. It reflects completely his ardent concern for the working man and his identification with them. Well, then we'll turn from those words to the building. This is the old Liberty Hall, which was the predecessor of that lovely skyscraper we opened our program with. And these men before it represent the working men of Ireland who gave their allegiance to a movement known as the Irish Citizen Army, a movement in whose ranks was Sean O'Casey, our dramatist to be. Now, this was no ordinary time in Ireland at the beginning of this century. And it was no ordinary labor movement either, because it combined a desire for economic freedom for the working man with political freedom for the nation. And when a large and very difficult time emerged in Ireland in 1913, an economic strife, it was reflected by this proclamation forbidding the Irish laboring people to carry on their threatened strike. They had threatened to strike, a general strike all through the city, but originating with the Tram Workers Union. They were opposed, of course, very fiercely by the employers, who sought in this opposition, and by that proclamation which they brought influence, which was issued by the government through their influence, the Irish managerial class sought to suppress forever Irish unionism. The workers, however, insisted upon their rights to strike, and in what is known as a Bloody Sunday in August 1913, we see on the streets of Dublin charges, baton charges, by the police, and everywhere men falling, wounded, bloody heads, broken heads, hospitalized as a result of all of this. This was a shock to Ireland, and it was a challenge also to the working man. The strike ended in what we can call a draw, except from this date on, the Irish working man knew that he had morally triumphed because he had stood up against the combined opposition of the employing class in Dublin. The results of that particular strike were carried on the newspapers all over the world. And here the London Daily Mirror shows the men wounded, the homes ransacked, children injured, and all that we might expect that would go with such a brutal and forcible suppression of men's rights to demonstrate. It reminds us indeed of the condition in America at the moment in certain places in the country. At any rate, the Irish working class pursued its determination to unite. And even when the World War I broke out, we notice in The Worker, the organ of the Irish working class, their slogan, business as usual for the employing classes, but for the working man, it makes little difference who wins this war. The Irish Citizen Army, then, was not just a group of people who were determined upon their right to strike, but it was a group of people who were also determined upon the right to free their country. Therefore, it was militant, as Sean O'Casey was militant in his ideas. And the Irish Citizen Army adopted for its flag a very interesting banner called the Plough and the Stars, which gave a title, indeed, to one of Sean O'Casey's great plays, referring, of course, to the constellation in heaven, which we call the Plough, and this demonstration of it may perhaps indicate to us some of the aspiring quality of their militancy. All of this, you see, centers around economic and political turmoil at the beginning of the 20th century. These then were the men, the Irish Citizen Army. These were the men who armed and marched and fought for the independence of the country and the independence of the laboring class. If you'll remember James Connolly's words at the very beginning, there is no freedom which does not offer freedom to the working class. This led inevitably to Easter Week 1916, and the Irish Citizen Army and Sean O'Casey were out now in a national rebellion against the English Empire. And this then is the result or the remnants of that bombardment, of the English bombardment of Dublin, during Easter week. And this is Liberty Hall after Easter week, after it had been reduced to ruins. This then is some of the turmoil which we must understand and appreciate before we can really understand O'Casey. I'll show you additionally a few scenes of the fighting after Easter week, after the armistice in World War I, when England was able to pour thousands of troops into Ireland, when she was able to conduct war, in other words, on a rather larger scale. Then one could see such scenes as this. This is a British barricade in the streets of Dublin, and these photographs were all taken by the newspaper services of the time. They are therefore historical. And these are the Tommies on Dublin roofs, maintaining guard over a street in which they expect some fighting to occur. These then are English cannon, which were used in some sections of the city to bombard and break down the centers where the rebels, as they were referred to, lay. These were the night searches, powerful searchlights at night, lighting up a house that had been cordoned off and was in the process of being searched now by the Black and Tans or by the English regulars. Finally, of course, there were the numerous interrogations. Citizens suspected of being members of the Irish Republican Army or being rebellious were questioned and, in some instances, tortured. Dubliners were accustomed also to seeing dead lie on the streets during this pitiful time. This then is the background. We have shown you the economic background for Sean O'Casey, and this then was the political background. These years then, in the beginning of the 19th century, were turbulent years, economically, socially, politically, militarily. And it was out of this fire that Sean O'Casey's work was born. And one cannot understand it unless he understands that. That provides the fire that is in O'Casey. Now, I should like to read with you today, then, excerpts from and make some comments upon one of his great plays, the Juno and the Paycock. It opens with a line. This, of course, I should say, succeeds. It comes just slightly after the period of the Black and Tans. This comes during the period of Ireland's Civil War, which followed hard upon the heels of the Black and Tans, the gradual withdrawal of the English from the country, and then the eruption into civil war, as civil war in America, civil war in England, civil war in Germany. It seems almost every modern nation has had to endure this great tragedy. So then it's understandable for us in the context of what we have just shown, that when this play opens with these words, "On a little by-road, out beyond Finglas, he was found." We are talking about a man's body. We are talking here about a die-hard, a Republican soldier, die-hard, the colloquial term, a Republican soldier during the Civil War, betrayed by his comrades to the new government. The new government that came in Ireland was the government of the Irish Free State. And the army, which had been fighting England, split in two, some people still holding out for a full-fledged republic, and some people deciding to take the partial freedom offered by the Irish Free State. So this is the tragic situation after all of this harrowing period in Irish history, now to have a civil war, brother fighting brother, and opening with these words, "On a little by-road out beyond Finglas, he was found." Now this play was put on in Dublin just a few years after the Civil War had terminated. You can therefore imagine what it meant to the people in Dublin. And then we go on now, and we learn that one of the characters in this family of Boyles is Johnny. And Johnny seems excessively perturbed As his sister Mary says about him, he's getting very sensitive all of a sudden. But he's perturbed to hear news about deaths. It upsets him quite a bit. And of course, we wonder why. But he's very demanding, as the Irishmen are sometimes said to be, very demanding on their women, and he wants people to wait on him. He's crippled, he's injured, he's been out in Easter week, and he's been crippled for life by British bullets and so on. But he says, bring us in a drink of water. He wants his sister and his mother always to wait upon him. This dependency is a part of what O'Casey is going to say, that in life, men are so dependent upon women, and they make life tragic for women, because the men themselves, as we learn later in the play, are inclined to be quite stupid. But Mrs. Boyle, the mother of the family, who is called Juno, the Roman goddess, the mother image Juno, who is, although her husband says, well, she's called Juno because we married in June and so on. Mrs. Boyle, in an exchange of conversation with her daughter is saying that she is going to go out on strike, she's going to stand up for her principles, and the mother wants to know, what are principles? After all, living is quite a principle, and standing up for principles. And Mary says, it doesn't matter what you say, Ma, a principle's a principle. And his mother said, yes, and look at your brother Johnny, crippled for life. I asked him not to fight against the Free State in this civil war. I got down on my bended knees and asked him not to go against the Free State. And Mary, being young, says, he stuck to his principles, Ma. No matter how you may argue, a principle's a principle. So what we are going to find in this play is that there is a great emphasis laid upon mere rhetoric. That is, are principles always principles? Now, Sean O'Casey was not less of a patriot, as some people thought, but he wanted to know at what point men had to place living and working and struggling ahead of slogans. Make the world safe for democracy, or the slogans of the Irish in this particular time. She has a husband, Captain Boyle, who of course never was a captain, but he's assumed the name of Captain, and he struts about, and he's something of a loafer. He doesn't like to go to work. Whenever work is mentioned, he develops such terrible pains in his legs and his back and so on. So that, you see, this again is something that the woman must suffer. So Captain Boyle comes in, and he's accompanied by a sycophantic type, a buddy who's always close by when the free cigarettes are to be handed out, or in this case, the free drink, whose name is Joxer. And Joxer is, again, a man of fluid rhetoric. You see what's happening here? The first lines of this brought our attention to one of these tragedies, such as you witnessed earlier in the photographs I showed you from that period. Here is a man, some woman's son, somebody's brother, out dead in an ambush. And life goes on just the same. We have Captain Boyle continuing to move, meander his easy way through life, a man who can't work, a man who's a drain simply upon his family, his wife. And Mrs. Boyle says, everybody calling you captain, and you only once on the water in an old collier from here to Liverpool, when anybody to listen or look at you would take you for a second Christopher Columbus. So he resents this sort of thing, of course, and takes himself out of the house. Then Mary's boyfriend, Jerry, who's a labor leader. Now you see, one would think, well, O'Casey will be very soft on the labor leader. But this particular labor leader is like a lot of other people. He's addicted to sloganeering. He's addicted to principles, but he forgets human people, human beings, I mean. He forgets flesh and blood, and the word is something to him. So Jerry is being put off now by Mary And he says, Mary, no matter what happens, you'll always be the same to me. We might very well anticipate that the dramatist will surely show us a bit later on that that's not quite so. Well, there are various comic scenes here now. For instance, when Juno goes out, after all, she is the one who has to go out, who has to keep the family going, who has to do anything that's to be done around there. When she goes out, then it's time for Boyle and Joxer to have a drink and to carry on their empty, inane conversation, not without its humor. The curious thing about O'Casey is in the midst of all of this tragedy, he can provide such farce. And Boyle, for instance, Jerry, the labor leader, had brought in a message to Boyle that Father Farrell could give him a job. And Boyle says, Father Farrell's beginning to take a great interest in Captain Boyle because of what Johnny did for his country, says he to me one day. It's a curious way to reward Johnny by making his poor old father work. But that's what the clergy want, Joxer. Work, work, work for me and you, having us muling from morning till night so that they may be in better fettle when they come hopping around for their dues. Job. Well, let him give his job to one of his hymn-singing, prayer-spouting, craw-thumping confraternity men. Well, of course, Joxer agrees with him and so on. But remember these words, because in a little while, Boyle is going to change them. Well, Mrs. Boyle remarks to her son in the course of some further family conversation about principles, you lost your best principle, my boy, when you lost your arm. She is constantly bringing things down to earth. And at this moment, Mary's preferred suitor comes in, Charles Bentham, a spruce young man, a teacher, a man who thinks he's on the way up. And Boyle tries to put on his most lavish side for him. He explains when Bentham remarks, what an interesting name, Juno. It reminds me of Homer's glorious story of ancient gods and heroes. Yes, doesn't it, Boyle says. You see, Juno was born and christened in June. I met her in June. We were married in June, and Johnny was born in June. So one day I says to her, you should have been called Juno. So Bentham is paying court to Mary, but he's also a man who brings news of some good fortune, so that this scene ends with the news that Bentham has brought. A legacy has befallen the family. So Act 1 opened on that note of tragedy, and all through it, we know from Johnny's presence that real tragedy runs as an undercurrent through all of this period. But here is life in the Dublin slums, and here is a family who gets this news, a rather trite situation in drama, certainly, but who gets this news of a legacy suddenly left. And now we watch the transformation, comic transformation, tragic comic transformation of characters. 2 days later, the Act 2 opens, and we find Boyle, addicted to words. Remember what I said about the addiction to words. Oh, it's a great responsibility, Joxer, a great responsibility to have all of this money to worry about. And then he has great things to say about Father Farrell and others. He reprimands people who don't appreciate the clergy. So you see, the effect upon an empty man like him is really, I suppose, to make him emptier. And all through Act 2, then, we watch this farcical, but not too removed from tragic, situation of the family living beyond its means now. While it awaits the legacy, there's a grand spending spree. And Charles Bentham, the new suitor, the man who has brought news of the legacy, the man indeed who wrote the will, which made the award to the Boyles, this man is in prominence. But the scene ends, again bringing us back to Johnny, because one of the Republican soldiers comes to Johnny it seems that Johnny is suspected of having betrayed the man whose death opened our scene, a former buddy. So here we have Juno, this woman who suffers all and has to be responsible for the whole family, and we have the serio-comic scenes underlying all of this, the turbulence in Ireland, and then Act 3, the final act, opens, and we learn 2 months have gone by, and we learn now that Bentham has skipped the country, and Mary is somewhat disconsolate. When her mother presses her and says she's not looking well and you must go to the doctor, the mother takes her to the doctor, and it is discovered that she is pregnant. Well, the father says she'll have to leave the house. Johnny has no concern for her. Only the mother can understand. Joxer and the captain go through their normal, unfeeling antics. And even Johnny says she'll have to leave the house. She'll have to get out of here. But then we also learn that Bentham had made a mistake in drawing up the will, and the family is not going to get the money after all. Now Johnny turns on his father and says, "You're far worse than even my sister. You've allowed us to spend and live recklessly." So there's internal dissension, there's civil war in the family, this family that lives on cliches, lives on principles, lives on rhetoric, except for the mother. And now we come across, in the midst of all of this, Jerry comes back. The man who had pledged his undying love and said Mary meant more than anything in the world, he comes back into the scene. And he says to Mary he knows everything and he still loves her and he'll still marry her. But what he doesn't know is of her pregnancy. And when he learns this, he turns his back and walks away. And then in comes, at this moment, 2 irregulars, as they are called, 2 diehards, 2 Republican soldiers, to haul Johnny out for his execution. And when the mother comes back, having been out of the house, looking after it, when she comes back and finds that her own son has been murdered, even as Mrs. Tancred's was, that was the mother of the buddy whom Johnny had betrayed, she says then, "Mary," she says to her daughter, "what can we do against the stupidity of men? Maybe I didn't feel sorry enough when this other woman had her son murdered. I should have prayed to Jesus to give us hearts of love instead of stone." Well, this is a rapid review of the drama that made O'Casey's name early famous. And here is his picture, haunting the city of Dublin as a ghost, really, over the city of Dublin today. A man whose heart was always in Dublin, but a man whose heart was forged in that crucible we showed you at the beginning of the program.
If you would like a list of selected readings to add to your enjoyment, please send a self-addressed stamped envelope to Professor John McKiernan, College of St. Thomas, St. Paul, Minnesota. This program has been presented as a public service by the Patrick Butler Family Foundation and produced at KTCA TV, Minneapolis, St. Paul.